Okay, so this video is going to cover autarky and free trade. This uses our supply and demand model to look at how a nation will import a good if they in free trade. So this also provides a different way of seeing the benefits from free trade. We explored that in chapters 3 and 4 with the comparative advantage and Heckscher-Ohlin models as one way to see it. Here's another way. We're looking at one product, say, wheat or steel, and so this is just traditional supply and demand. And I've previously made a diagram for a video talking about the construction of the supply curve when you're combining domestic supply plus a world supply. This is going to be autarky and free trade in a small nation. So I've already got the world supply curve drawn in here. It's horizontal, showing that this nation can purchase as much of this good as they want at the world price. So let's start by, and we're going to proceed in this fashion by comparing the equilibrium. We can say, what's the equilibrium if there's autarky, which means no trade, and then what would be the equilibrium in this model if we have full free trade, if goods are able to come into this country as reflected by the supply curve. So that's what we're going to do here. So we'll start with autarky. In autarky, we have the domestic supply curve and the domestic demand curve. There's only one demand curve, but I'll still say it's domestic. This is what the people living in this country want to buy of this good, and this is what the domestic or home country suppliers are willing to supply at different prices. When there's no possibility of international trade, then equilibrium is simply that the price where the quantity demand and quantity supply using the domestic supply curve intersect. So that's here. And so we would call we'll call that PA, that's the autarky price. And then we would have over here, down here we would get the quantity. And that's this is the price at which the quantity that domestic consumers wish to buy equals the quantity that domestic producers wish to sell at the same price. So we have that. And so we can start filling this out over here of autarky and free trade. So the price under autarky is going to be PA. And then the consumption, we're going to have consumption and domestic production. They're going to be different here in a bit, but in autarky, they have to be the same. So we'll put QA there for both. And since there's no possibility of international trade, there's no imports. Let's see, we also have to do consumer and producer surplus. And to do that, I have to put some, I have to designate the areas here. Consumer surplus, remember the definition is the difference between the value that consumers place on a unit and what they have to pay for it. In the supply and demand graph, that would be the area that's below the demand curve and above whatever price that consumers are paying for the good. And that would be an area. Producer surplus is the difference between the price that suppliers receive for the good when they sell it in the market and the minimum price that they would need to receive to be willing to supply that good and offer it for sale. And so that on the supply and demand diagram would be the difference between the price that the suppliers receive, the price in the market, and the supply curve. So the area under the demand curve and above the price, here's the demand curve, here's the price that consumers pay in autarky. So we have this area here, we'll call that area 1. That's a triangle. That's the triangle there. Since the demand curve is linear, it is a triangle. It would be the area that's below the demand curve and above the price PA. Then we've got this producer surplus would be the area that's below this price here, PA, and then above the supply curve, the domestic supply curve. So that's a triangle there, but we've got the world supply curve going through there. So I'm going to label those two areas 2 and 3. We're going to label them separately. But then we can come over here and fill in with the consumer and producer surplus. So in autarky, consumer surplus is area 1. These numbers refer to the areas on the graph. And then the producer surplus would be areas 2 and 3. And so that is the autarky equilibrium. And whether this nation was ever in autarky or not doesn't really matter in the context of this model. we can describe and define what the autarky equilibrium is, we can specify it in the model, and we will compare the equilibrium under free trade to that autarky equilibrium, whether or not that ever existed in this country. So now we have free trade, and this is a small nation. They can buy as much as they want at the world price. So they face a horizontal world supply curve. I already have that drawn in here. And then the domestic suppliers will supply up until you get to the world supply curve, and then this part of the domestic supply curve becomes irrelevant because consumers aren't going to have to pay a price that gets us up here on this part of the domestic supply curve when they can buy as much as they want from the world at this price here. So we have to label that price. I'll call that PW. That's the world price. And another way of thinking about it, a small nation takes that world price as given. They can buy as much as they want at that world price, and that world price doesn't go up. So this would have to be a small nation, say buying a relatively small amount of steel or a relatively small amount of wheat on the world market. Now, that's the price. So now we have to figure out how much would consumers buy. Well, we would just take this price over the domestic demand curve, and that's here. They intersect here, and we'll come down here, and I'll call that Q2. And over here, we're to figure out how much the suppliers will supply, we take the PW over the domestic supply curve, and this is the quantity. We'll call this Q1. Q1 is the quantity that the domestic firms are willing to supply if they have to sell at a price of PW, and they're constrained to sell at a price of PW because their consumers could go to suppliers from the rest of the world and buy it at PW. They're only going to buy as much from domestic suppliers as domestic suppliers are willing to supply at the price of PW, and that's Q1. So we actually have here now the equilibrium with free trade. We have a price where the quantity demanded by domestic consumers actually equals the quantity supplied, because the domestic firms will supply the quantity Q1, and then the international firms will supply the quantity between Q1 and Q2. That's going to be the imports. And so the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity that the domestic consumers demand at a price of PW. That's an equilibrium. So now we can come over here and describe the free trade equilibrium. The world price, the price is going to be PW, that world price. The consumption, domestic consumers now consume Q2. Domestic production, though, is Q1. That's why I labeled them differently here, even though they, in autarky, they turned out to be the same amount, but there's a different amount here. And then the imports, the imports would be the quantities that this nation gets from other suppliers. So imports would be Q2 minus Q1. Whereas they have, by definition, there's no imports with autarky. So we can compare this here. We can see with free trade, the price falls, the domestic consumption goes up. Consumers in this nation get to consume more. Not that they want to consume more, their demand curve doesn't change, but because they can buy it cheaper from the world suppliers than they would have to from domestic suppliers, the law of demand says they'd be willing to buy more, and so they are able to consume more. But domestic production does go down. And of course, imports went up because there were no imports with autarky. All right, so now we have to figure out what the consumer and producer surplus will be. And for this, I've got to label a couple more areas here because we've got some more consumer surplus. But the definition for consumer surplus would be the area that's below the demand curve and above the price. But now in the free trade equilibrium, the world price is PW. So that's the price that consumers get to buy at. So all of the area, this is still a triangle, but all of the area that's below the domestic demand curve and above the PW price line is consumer surplus. So that would be areas 1, 2, 4, and 5. And then we've got producer surplus. That's the area that's below the price and above the supply curve. Here the supply curve is for the domestic suppliers, and that's just area 3. So we have that there. So let's consider now what the consumer and producer surplus tell us here. we can see that areas 1, 2, and 3 were the consumer and producer surplus before, and they still are either consumer or producer surplus. So we still have all of the gains from trade. Another way to think about consumer and producer surplus combined, it's the total surplus or it's the gains from trade from producing and consuming this good. So we have all of the surplus that we had before, and now we've got two new areas of surplus, 4 and 5. So the total surplus goes up. And that's another way of seeing that how that international trade can produce gains from trade. That we have more total surplus, more gains from trade with in the equilibrium with free trade than we had with autarky equilibrium. And so again, that's another way compared to, think back to what we showed with in chapter 3, looking at the comparative advantage model, where we saw like, oh, a nation could get at a point beyond their production possibilities curve by specializing in trade. Here's another way of seeing it. We have more gains from trade in the free trade equilibrium than we had in autarky. If you want to think about it a little bit more, we can see that area 4 is some surplus on the units between Q1 and QA. These units were being consumed and produced, and we can see that they were generating some consumer and producer surplus. Because if you want to think about this here, there's some surplus being generated on these units. What happens is we end up with more surplus being generated on these units. Why is that? Well, because they're no longer produced by domestic consumers. The height of the supply curve shows the value of the resources that the domestic firms need to use to supply them. They need to use more resources to produce these units here than producers in the rest of the world would have to pay. So what used to cover the payments that used to go to domestic suppliers to cover these resource costs no longer have to cover resource costs, and consumers get a lower price. So we get some additional surplus on these units that were already being consumed, produced and consumed in autarky. And then we've got area 5 is above the quantity QA to Q2. Those units were not being produced or consumed in the autarky equilibrium. Because consumers get to buy, are able to buy more units at the lower price with free trade, they can have some consumer surplus on those units. They value those units more than they pay for them. So area 5 is the area that's below the demand curve and above the price, the PW price line, on these units that consumers now get to consume that they didn't get before. So area 5 comes from the expansion of production. But if we look at consumer and producer surplus, we see one additional thing, area 2. Area 2 was producer surplus in autarky. It is consumer surplus with free trade. Here's area 2. So this was surplus before, it's still surplus. But the identity of who's getting it changes. It was going to the producers, but now it goes to consumers. Because consumers can buy these units, they can buy these units at a lower price. These units here would still be, up to Q1 would still be produced domestically, but domestic suppliers have to supply them at a lower price. They have to compete with this world price of PW. So they still are willing to supply these units and sell them at a lower price, so consumers get the surplus, not the producers. And then these units here, they were being produced domestically, now they're being imported, but at a lower price, so consumers get the surplus that was going to producers. But what we can see here is areas 4 and 5 are in addition to the surplus, so that's in that way we can say that there are gains from trade, and that's why economists would say that the free trade equilibrium is more efficient or better. That's a normative term. So we're saying that the free trade equilibrium is better with regard to generating surplus or generating gains from trade than the autarky equilibrium. But we do see that domestic consumers are worse off in that they get less surplus now than they did before. They get fewer of the gains from trade here. But those gains from trade don't go away. And they also produce less. So the domestic production has gone down. That would reflect smaller production, fewer domestic firms, hiring fewer workers. This would be a smaller domestic sector producing steel or wheat or whatever the good this happens to be than we would have had in free trade. But that's good because at some level we live in a world of scarcity. when the resources that were being used to produce these units domestically no longer have to be used, they're freed up. In a world of scarcity, they would go and produce those resources are used to produce something else. This is supply and demand. It's what we call partial equilibrium. We can't say where those resources would go, but we live in a world of scarcity, and so those resources would get released to produce something else, something that this nation has an advantage or a comparative advantage in producing. So that's free trade versus autarky. We go this to see the benefits from trade, and then we'll go from here to see how a tariff can disrupt some of these benefits from free trade.